Okay, so we're diving into kind of a different question today. What was the world like, before the flood? We always talk about the flood itself, but what about like all the stuff leading up to it?
Yeah,
And
it's an interesting.
you've got some excerpts here from the Book of Jasher, which I'll be honest, I don't know a ton about.
Yeah.
But just reading through them, it's pretty wild.
Well, it's a really fascinating book. Not quite as well known as some of the other texts, but it does give us like some additional details
Yeah.
and context around these,
Yeah.
familiar stories like the flood narrative.
Right, right. And one of the first things that just jumps out when you start reading this
Yeah.
is how long people lived back then. Like Enoch lived to be 905,
Yeah.
Cainan 910, Jared almost hit 962.
Yeah, that's a lot of birthdays.
That's a lot of birthdays. I mean, that's just mind-blowing. How do we even like wrap our heads around that?
Right. It definitely challenges our modern understanding of,
Mm.
time and
Yeah.
what it means to be human. Some people interpret those ages literally. Some see them as more symbolic,
Hmm.
maybe a different way of understanding time or emphasizing the wisdom and spiritual stature of these figures.
Yeah, that's fascinating. But here's where it gets really interesting to me, because God gives humanity 120 years before the flood as a warning. And, to us, 120 years is like a really long time.
Yeah, an entire lifetime.
Yeah, but when you're talking about people living for 900 years, suddenly 120 years is like, oh, okay, things are getting real. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
definitely takes on a new sense of urgency, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, whoa. So it makes you wonder, like,
Yeah.
was that warning also kind of signaling like a big drop in how long people were living?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Was there like a sudden decline in lifespan?
Right, like what could cause that?
Well, the Book of Jasher does point to
Yeah.
kind of this increasing wickedness in humanity
Mm-hmm.
as a potential factor.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe this decline in lifespan was like a consequence of straying from a righteous path.
So it wasn't just like God's coming in and just being like, all right, everybody's bad, flood time.
Yeah.
It was like there was a real attempt to turn things around, right?
Absolutely. It emphasizes that both Noah and his grandfather Methuselah,
Hmm.
they were both going around delivering this message of repentance for a full 120 years.
Whoa.
So this wasn't a snap decision.
Mm-hmm.
The author of Jasher really wants to highlight this extended period of grace, God's mercy, his desire for reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
The flood was the last resort.
That's powerful. But here's the thing. Noah at first
Mm.
hesitates to even get married and have kids.
Yeah.
Because he's like, well, what's the point? The world's ending anyway.
Yeah.
Like you can kind of relate to that feeling of like, why even bother?
Like that's a really human moment of doubt and despair. You're faced with these overwhelming circumstances.
Yeah.
And you just wonder, what's the point?
Yeah.
But then his decision to follow God's command, that says a lot about faith.
Mm-hmm.
Trusting in a greater plan, even when it doesn't make sense.
And then he goes and names his sons Japheth, which means God has enlarged, and Shem, which means God has made me a remnant. Like he's already thinking about what comes after the flood before it even happens.
That's so interesting. Those names become so powerful. When you think about the flood, Japheth's descendants, they're going to spread out across the world. Shem's line will carry on that lineage of faith.
It's like foreshadowing the future of humanity right there in their names. But then you've got Lamech, Noah's father, who doesn't exactly follow in the footsteps of his own father, Methuselah. He's making different choices.
Right. Even within families, there are these
Mm-hmm.
diverging paths.
Yeah.
Some choose righteousness, some stray.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, like, what was going on in that society that was, like, pushing people in different directions, even within the same family?
That's a great question. And to understand that, we really need to look deeper into this idea of wickedness as it's presented in Jasher. Like, what did that actually mean? What was it that ultimately led to the flood?
Right. Because wickedness feels kind of vague. Like, what were people actually doing?
Yeah.
Was it, like, specific actions or just, like, a general turning away from God?
Well, that's a question that has led to a lot of different interpretations. Some scholars point to things like violence, idolatry, maybe sexual immorality. Others suggest it was more of a gradual erosion of faith and morality, a rejection of divine principles.
So it's not like Jasher gives us this clear list of here are the sins. It's more like it's making us think about what wickedness could look like in any time.
Right. It's a powerful way to engage the reader.
Yeah.
It's like it's forcing us to confront those uncomfortable questions about what constitutes wickedness in our own time.
Right, yeah. So we've got this backdrop of increasing wickedness. God decides to bring the flood. But before that happens, there's this whole business of building the ark. And this thing was huge. Jasher says it was 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high.
Huh.
And just to give people context, a cubit's about the length of a forearm. So we're talking about a vessel that's over 450 feet long, longer than a football field.
Wow. Yeah, the scale it's almost unimaginable. And you have to wonder, like, how did they manage that? The engineering, the logistics, especially with the tools and resources they would have had back then.
Right. Like, I'm picturing Noah out there with his sons, chopping down these massive trees, shaping these huge timbers, fitting them all together. I mean, talk about backbreaking work. I'm guessing they didn't have power tools back then.
Right.
And not just building it, but making it watertight, too.
Yeah.
Jasher talks about it being covered inside and out with pitch.
Right.
Like, the amount of effort.
It's mind-boggling.
It's like building this giant floating fortress to withstand this, like, ultimate storm.
But it's not just about size and practicality. The design itself, like 3 levels, a single door, a window. Like, that suggests that there's some deeper meaning there, right?
Absolutely. Some scholars see those 3 levels as representing different realms of creation. Maybe heaven, earth, the underworld. The single door, like, that's the only way in or out, symbolizing the separation between the saved and the doomed.
Whoa.
And then the window, providing light and ventilation, like a connection to the divine, God's presence amidst the deluge.
Wow. So the ark is more than just this big wooden box.
Yeah.
It's like carefully designed.
There's a symbolism pack in there.
Okay, but then you got to fill this thing with animals,
Right.
2 of every kind.
Yeah.
How do you even begin to round up all those animals and get them on this massive boat?
Well, that's a logistical puzzle. That's baffled people for centuries.
Yeah.
Jasher doesn't go into a ton of detail about that.
Right.
But just the sheer variety of animals that are mentioned suggests it must have been a very meticulous and divinely guided process. I mean, can you picture Noah and his family trying to wrangle all these creatures, herding them up the ramp into this ark?
It must have been quite a sight.
Yeah, talk about a wild adventure. And then there's the human element, too. We often forget Noah had to find wives for his sons.
Oh, right.
Imagine trying to arrange marriages when the world's about to end.
Yeah, like, hey, want to grab coffee and, maybe repopulate the earth after this whole flood thing.
Not exactly your typical first date conversation.
Definitely not.
But Jasher tells us, Noah chose the daughters of Eliakim, who was a descendant of Methuselah. So it's not just random matchmaking. He's specifically choosing wives who represent this continuation of faith, obedience.
Right. It's about preserving not just the human race,
Right.
but a specific lineage.
Right.
A bloodline connected to righteousness.
And that speaks to this deeper message in the flood story. Even amidst all this destruction, there's this focus on preserving that remnant of humanity, those who represent the potential
for a new beginning.
But let's be real for a second. Wiping out almost every living thing on Earth, even if the world had become wicked, seems like a pretty extreme measure.
It does.
Couldn't God have found a more targeted approach? Was the flood really the only option?
That's a question that's challenged people for millennia.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront the nature of divine justice, the balance between mercy and judgment.
Right, because you have God giving these warnings, 120 years worth of warnings, this chance for humanity to repent.
Yeah.
But then there's this ultimate decision to bring the flood, to cleanse the world in this really dramatic, irreversible way.
Some people see it as a necessary act.
Yeah.
To cleanse the world of corruption and to provide a clean slate for a new beginning. Others see it as a stark warning, a reminder of the consequences of straying from a righteous path.
It's a lot to process.
It is.
And I don't think there's an easy answer, but I think it's important to acknowledge those questions, to wrestle with the complexities of the story rather than shying away from them.
Absolutely. Those questions are what make these stories so enduring. They challenge us to think critically about faith, morality, our place in the world.
So we've talked about the warnings, the ark, the animals, the wives. We're really starting to get a sense of what this pre-flood world was like. But before we get into the flood itself, I want to zoom out for a second. What does this story tell us about humanity's relationship with the divine?
It's a story about human fallibility, but also the power of grace and redemption. Even when we make choices that have these devastating consequences, there's always this possibility for renewal, for starting over.
It's interesting to think about the flood as like this dividing line, right? You have the world before with these incredibly long lifespans, a society that's struggling with wickedness, and then you have the world after, where humanity gets this fresh start, like hitting the reset button. But things are different this time. Lifespans are shorter. And there's this sense of a new beginning. Like, imagine being part of that first generation, born after the flood, the stories you'd hear from your parents, your grandparents, about the world before they would shape your whole understanding of the world.
Right. It wouldn't just be history. It'd be foundational myths, shaping culture, morality.
Yeah, like this collective memory of what happened before, serving as this constant reminder of the consequences. Don't mess this up, kids. Remember the flood.
Exactly. The flood becomes this powerful symbol woven into their society.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this world before the flood, I have a question for you. Now that we know what we know about this pre-flood society, how does that change how we view the flood story itself? Does it make Noah's decision to build the ark seem more understandable, knowing the world was kind of on the brink of collapse? Does it make the flood seem more tragic, knowing that lives were lost? Or maybe more necessary, given the state of humanity?
You know, that's such a great question, and I don't think there's just one answer. Every person brings their own perspective, interpretation to these ancient stories. But understanding the context, the world before the flood, it adds these layers of meaning to the narrative. We see the flood not as this isolated event, but as the culmination of a long and complex history, a history marked by human failings, but also the possibility of redemption.
So for those listening, imagine yourself standing alongside Noah, looking out at this world, about to be engulfed, knowing what you now know about the choices made, the lives lived, the warnings ignored. How does that make you feel? And what lessons can we draw from this ancient story to guide our own actions and decisions in the world today?
These ancient stories hold timeless insights into human nature, faith, the choices we make. They remind us that even when we face seemingly impossible challenges, there's always hope for renewal, for starting anew.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. What would you do if you were Noah? How would you navigate a world on the brink? It's a question worth pondering.
It is.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about the flood as this dividing line. You've got the world before, with these crazy long lifespans, and society is kind of wrestling with this increasing wickedness. And then boom, the flood comes, and it's like the world after. Humanity gets this fresh start. It's like hitting the reset button. But this time, things are different. Lifespans are shorter. There's this feeling of a new beginning. Can you imagine being part of that first generation born after the flood? Like the stories you would hear from your parents, your grandparents, about the world before it.
Wow.
It would shape your whole understanding of the world.
Totally. It wouldn't just be history. It would be like foundational myths, shaping your culture, morality.
Yeah, it'd be like this. Collective memory of what happened before, like a constant reminder of the consequences. Like, hey, kids, don't mess this up. Remember what happened. Remember the flood.
Exactly. This powerful symbol woven into their society.
Okay, so as we're wrapping up our deep dive into this world before the flood, I have one final question for you, now that we know all this stuff about this pre-flood society. Does it change how we view the flood story itself? Like, does it make Noah's decision to build the ark seem more understandable, knowing the world was on the verge of collapse? Or does it make the flood seem more tragic, knowing that lives were lost, or maybe even more necessary, given the state of humanity?
That's such a profound question. And honestly, I don't think there's just one answer. You know, every person brings their own perspective, their own interpretation to these ancient stories. But I think understanding the context, understanding the world before the flood, it adds these layers of meaning to the narrative. We see the flood not as this isolated event, but as the culmination of this long and complex history that's marked by human failings, but also this possibility of redemption.
So, for everyone listening, I want you to imagine yourself standing there with Noah, looking out at this world that's about to be engulfed by the flood, knowing everything you know now. about the choices people made, the lives that were lived, the warnings that were ignored. How does that make you feel? And what lessons can we take from this ancient story to guide our own actions, our own decisions in the world today?
These ancient stories, they hold these timeless insights
Yeah.
into human nature, faith, the choices we make. They remind us that even when we face these insurmountable challenges, there's always hope for renewal, for starting anew.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. What would you do if you were Noah? How would you navigate a world on the brink? It's a question worth thinking about.
It is. Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. And it also makes you realize like how much we can learn from these ancient stories, even though they were written, thousands of years ago.
Absolutely. They still speak to us today in such powerful ways.
Yeah, they really do. So to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive into the world before the flood has given you some new insights and maybe even some new questions to ponder.
Yeah, we always encourage our listeners to keep digging, to keep exploring these fascinating stories and to find their own meaning in them.
And if you're interested in learning more about the Book of Jasher, we'll be sure to include some links in the show notes where you can find more information and resources. And as always, we love hearing from you, so feel free to reach out on social media or leave us a comment on the website. We really appreciate you joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.